If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The Intruder at Home. I don't usually work late shifts, but last Friday, I covered for a coworker who called out sick. By the time I clocked out, it was almost midnight, and I was exhausted. My car's gas tank was nearly empty, so I had to stop at one of those 24-hour stations a few miles from my house. The place was completely deserted except for one other car parked at the farthest pump. As I got out, I noticed a man leaning against the car, staring at me. At first, I thought he might just be zoned out or waiting for someone, but the way his eyes followed me as I walked to the pump sent a shiver down my spine. Still, I told myself to shake it off. People stare, right? No big deal. As I filled my tank, I could feel his gaze burning into me. I glanced over again, trying to act casual, but he was still standing there, not moving, just watching. That's when he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was wide and slow, like he was enjoying something I couldn't see. I tried to ignore him, finishing up as quickly as I could. When I went to pay at the pump, the machine froze, forcing me to walk inside to the cashier. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. People are weird sometimes, but that doesn't mean they're dangerous. At least, that's what I tried to believe as I hurried back to my car. I didn't see him move, but as I pulled out of the station, I noticed headlights behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. It was late, and there weren't many cars on the road. But as I turned down my street, those same headlights turned with me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. By the time I parked in my driveway, I realized I hadn't seen the car continue down the road. My street was usually quiet, and no one ever parked out there late at night. That little voice in the back of my head started nagging, but I tried to push it down as I grabbed my bag and headed inside. My house felt eerily silent when I walked in. Normally, I'd hear my dad snoring from the living room or the sound of the TV still playing, but that night, nothing. I figured everyone had gone to bed early. I locked the door behind me, tossed my keys on the counter, and started heading upstairs. As I passed the dining room, I thought I heard a soft scrape, like a chair moving slightly. I froze. My first instinct was to brush it off. It's an old house, and weird noises weren't unusual. But something about the silence afterward made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears, but when I didn't hear anything else, I forced myself to move on. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it again, another faint scrape like wood against tile. My stomach dropped. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I slowly turned back, my eyes darting to the dining room. The lights were off, but the faint glow from the kitchen illuminated enough for me to see the table and chairs. At first, everything looked normal. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but then I saw it. A shadow shifted, just barely, but enough to freeze me in place. Someone was under the table. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I could only stand there, staring at the dark shape crouched between the chairs. Whoever it was wasn't moving now, but I knew they'd seen me. My mind raced. Did I lock the door behind me? Yes, I was sure I did. So how the hell did he get in? My phone was upstairs, out of reach, and my family was asleep. For a split second, I considered bolting for the front door, but I was terrified of what he might do if I turned my back. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, but eventually, my survival instincts kicked in. I forced myself to take a step back, as quietly as I could, toward the stairs. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, just as I reached the bottom step, he moved. It was sudden, a low shuffle as he started crawling out from under the table. I didn't even think. I bolted up the stairs, taking 2 at a time. I didn't look back, but I could hear him. His footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me. When I reached the top, I threw myself into my parents' room and slammed the door shut. My dad shot up, startled, and I barely managed to blurt out, "Someone's in the house," before the doorknob rattled. Whoever it was had followed me upstairs and was trying to get in. My dad jumped out of bed, yelling loud enough to wake the whole house. The rattling stopped, and for a second, everything went silent. Then we heard the sound of footsteps, fast, retreating back down the stairs. My dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept in the corner of the room and tore out into the hallway, yelling for the guy to show himself. I stayed behind, clutching my mom, who had woken up and was frantically trying to call the police. From the top of the stairs, I could see the front door wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. My dad ran down, checking every room, every corner, but the intruder was gone. When the police arrived a few minutes later, they searched the house and the yard, but there was no sign of him. Then one of the officers pointed something out that made my stomach turn. The back door, the one we almost never used, was unlocked. Worse, there were scratch marks around the lock, like someone had used a tool to break in. That meant he'd been in the house long before I even got home. The thought made me feel sick. I kept replaying everything in my head: the gas station, the way he watched me, the shadow under the table. He must have followed me from there, but how long had he been hiding? The police tried to reassure us, but their faces gave away what they really thought. The guy was long gone, and there wasn't much they could do. They asked me for a description, but honestly, I didn't have much to give. All I could remember was the unsettling way he stared at me at the gas station and that twisted smile. They promised to patrol the neighborhood for the next few nights, but I could tell they weren't hopeful. After they left, we tried to settle down, but none of us could sleep. Every little creak in the house felt like a warning. The scariest part came the next morning when I went to the dining room. I don't know why I went in there. I think I just wanted to prove to myself that it was over. But when I got close to the table, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the floor, right where he'd been crouching, was a knife. A long, serrated kitchen knife that didn't belong to us. I just stared at it, my legs threatening to give out. He hadn't been hiding under there to scare me. He was waiting. We called the police again, and they took the knife for evidence, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Knowing he had been armed, that he was ready to do something if I hadn't noticed him, it made my skin crawl. For days, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. What if I hadn't heard that scrape? What if I had gone straight to bed without realizing someone was in the house? Worse, what if he hadn't run when my dad confronted him? It's been a few weeks now, and I'm still on edge. Every time I walk into the dining room, I find myself glancing under the table, just to be sure. I've changed my routines completely. No more late-night shifts, no more stopping at sketchy gas stations. But the truth is, I still don't feel safe. Whoever he was, he's still out there, and the police never found him. Sometimes, when the house is too quiet, I find myself listening for that faint scrape of a chair. It's stupid, I know, but I can't help it. A part of me feels like he's not done, like it was only by sheer luck that I got away that night. The fake car trouble. I was driving down I-95 early one Saturday morning, heading from New York to Florida. It was barely 5 a.m., and the world still felt half asleep. The road stretched ahead of me like an endless ribbon, flanked by the silhouettes of trees on either side. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, and the quiet hours of the morning seemed perfect for making good time. My car, a beat-up Honda Civic I'd had since college, was packed with everything I'd need for the next 2 weeks. Snacks, clothes, even my trusty old camping gear. I like to think of myself as prepared for anything. At least, that's what I told myself before everything went sideways. The trouble started just past the Maryland border. I saw a pair of hazard lights blinking up ahead, a faint amber glow cutting through the dark. As I approached, I could make out an old sedan pulled over on the shoulder, its hood propped up and steam curling into the cold morning air. There was a man standing beside it, waving his arms like he was trying to flag someone down. He looked harmless enough, middle-aged, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his face lit up with relief when I slowed my car. I hesitated for a moment. I mean, who stops for strangers these days? But something about the situation felt genuine. He looked desperate, and besides, it was barely dawn. It didn't seem like the kind of time a person would stage trouble. I pulled over a few yards ahead of the sedan and grabbed a flashlight from my glove compartment. As I approached, the man walked toward me, his hands slightly raised, like he wanted to show he wasn't a threat. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice shaky but polite. "My car just died on me, completely dead. I think it's the battery or maybe the alternator, but I'm not sure." He gestured toward the open hood, and I instinctively glanced over. It was hard to see much in the dim light, but the engine bay looked like it had seen better days. I asked him a few basic questions, but he seemed frazzled and didn't really answer directly. Then, out of nowhere, something shifted in the atmosphere. It's hard to describe, but I suddenly felt watched. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe it was just the isolation of being on a dark stretch of highway, alone with a stranger. But the feeling grew stronger when I noticed how he kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone, or something. His responses to my questions became vaguer, and his hand gestures started to feel more like a distraction than anything else. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch of gravel behind me. My stomach sank as I turned my head and saw 2 shadowy figures emerging from the tree line near the shoulder. My pulse spiked, and I instinctively took a step back. The 2 figures were moving quickly, their shapes growing clearer as they stepped into the faint glow of the sedan's hazard lights. They looked rough, one tall and wiry, the other shorter but solid, both dressed in dark, nondescript clothes. Neither of them spoke, but their intentions were loud and clear in the way they moved, closing in with purpose. The man near the sedan didn't even flinch. In fact, he stepped aside as if making room for them, his earlier panic replaced by a cold detachment that made my stomach churn. "Hey, hold on," I stammered, backing toward my car. "What's going on here?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The shorter guy grinned, a flash of teeth that felt more like a predator sizing up prey. "Relax," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We just need a little help." The man from the sedan crossed his arms and leaned against the car, watching silently, while the other 2 spread out, boxing me in. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam darting over the pavement as I tried to figure out what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my car felt impossibly far away now, and the thought of turning my back on them made my skin crawl. I decided to act before they could close the gap. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and I took a chance, swinging it hard at the taller guy as he lunged toward me. The light cracked against his arm, and he let out a startled grunt, stumbling back. That gave me just enough of an opening to break into a sprint. I darted past them, heading not for my car, but toward the tree line on the opposite side of the highway. Adrenaline roared in my ears as I crashed through the underbrush, the world around me reduced to darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Behind me, I could hear them shouting, their voices growing fainter the deeper I went into the woods. My legs burned, and branches snagged at my clothes, but I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like an eternity, I found a cluster of dense trees and crouched low, struggling to catch my breath. I stayed there, trembling, listening for any sign of pursuit. The woods were eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I thought I was safe until I caught a glimpse of movement in the distance, a faint beam of light weaving through the trees. They were still looking for me. I pressed myself against the trunk of a tree, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The flashlight beams flickered closer, sweeping erratically across the forest floor. I could hear their voices now, low and agitated. "He couldn't have gotten far," one of them muttered. "Spread out." The other answered with a grunt, and the beams split, each heading in a different direction. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they'd hear it, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. One of the beams came dangerously close, passing just a few feet from where I hid. I held my breath, frozen, as the man moved past, his heavy boots crunching on the dead leaves. Once he was far enough away, I took a chance and slipped further into the woods, keeping low and silent. I didn't dare turn on my phone for light, fearing it might give me away, so I moved blind, feeling my way through the dark. My only goal was to put as much distance between me and them as possible, but the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. After what felt like miles of stumbling through the woods, I finally stopped to catch my breath. My legs were trembling, and my lungs burned with every inhale. I leaned against a tree, trying to orient myself, but everything looked the same, just endless darkness and gnarled branches. Panic crept in as I realized I had no idea which way I'd come from or where the highway was. Worse, the distant crunch of leaves told me they were still searching. I was running out of options. That's when I spotted a faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it might be their flashlights, but this light was different. Softer, steadier. Could it be a cabin? A campsite? I decided to risk it and moved cautiously toward the glow, keeping my steps as quiet as possible. As I got closer, the light resolved into a small clearing where an old weather-beaten RV was parked. It looked abandoned, the windows fogged and the door hanging slightly ajar. My gut told me it might not be safe, but the prospect of shelter, and possibly a way to call for help, was too tempting to ignore. I crept up to the RV, every instinct on high alert. The closer I got, the more I noticed little details that made my skin crawl. The RV wasn't just old, it looked like it had been sitting there for years. Rust streaked its sides, and moss clung to the edges of the roof. A broken lawn chair lay tipped over nearby, half buried in the dirt. Still, it felt like my best shot. I climbed the 2 small steps to the door, wincing at the creak of the metal under my weight. Slowly, I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like something out of a horror movie. Inside, the air was thick and stale, filled with the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The space was cramped, littered with random junk, old newspapers, empty cans, a broken lamp. A faded couch sat at the far end, its fabric torn and stuffing spilling out. But what really caught my attention was the phone mounted to the wall near the door. It was one of those old landlines, the kind you don't see much anymore. My heart leapt at the sight. I grabbed the receiver and pressed it to my ear, but all I got was silence. No dial tone, nothing. Frustrated, I slammed it back onto the hook, the noise echoing louder than I intended. The sound of the phone slamming down felt like a mistake the second it echoed through the RV. My body went cold as I stood there, frozen, straining to hear if anyone outside had noticed. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the hum of silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside. They weren't far, and they weren't casual. Whoever it was, they were moving with purpose. My mind raced. I looked around for something to defend myself with, anything, and my eyes landed on a rusty tire iron lying on the floor near the door. I grabbed it just as the footsteps stopped, right outside the RV. My breath hitched, and I tightened my grip, the metal cool and rough in my hand. The door creaked again, this time under someone else's weight. I braced myself, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly, a shadow passed by the small, grimy window beside the door. I couldn't tell if it was one of the men from earlier or something else entirely. A sharp knock shattered the silence, making me jump. "We know you're in there," a voice called, low and calm but with an edge that made my stomach churn. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The voice outside was steady, almost mocking, and the way he spoke sent a chill through me. "Come on out," he continued, his tone dripping with fake patience. "We just want to talk." A second voice chimed in from farther away, laughing. "Yeah, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay silent. My mind reeled, trying to figure out what to do. Running wasn't an option. I didn't know the terrain, and they were too close. Fighting seemed just as hopeless, but I had the tire iron, and I wasn't ready to give up yet. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and I heard the faint scrape of metal against the door. They were trying to force their way in. My hands were slick with sweat as I backed away toward the far end of the RV. My heel hit something solid, and I turned to see a small emergency exit at the back. It was partially jammed, the latch rusty, but it was my only chance. I dropped the tire iron for a second and pulled at the latch with everything I had. It groaned in protest, but finally gave way with a loud pop. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tiny space. The moment the latch gave way, I shoved the emergency exit open and scrambled out, landing hard on the damp ground. Pain shot through my knees, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts as I darted back into the woods. Behind me, I heard shouting. The door to the RV had been forced open, and they must have realized I'd slipped out the back. Their flashlights cut through the dark like knives, and the beams danced erratically as they chased after me. I ran blindly, branches whipping against my face and arms. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me moving. I could hear them crashing through the brush, their voices growing louder. "He's this way," one of them yelled. I pushed harder, forcing my body to keep going even as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The woods seemed endless, and for a horrifying moment, I wondered if I'd run straight into a trap, another clearing, another group of them waiting. My thoughts spiraled, and I was starting to feel the weight of hopelessness when I caught sight of something through the trees. Headlights. The sight of the headlights sent a jolt of hope through me, but I didn't let myself slow down. I couldn't be sure if it was a passing car or something worse, one of theirs. As I got closer, the unmistakable hum of an engine reached my ears, and I realized it was a car driving along the highway. I practically threw myself toward the light, breaking through the tree line onto the shoulder. A pickup truck was coming up the road, its headlights cutting through the gloom. I waved my arms frantically, yelling for help. The truck slowed, its tires crunching on the gravel. For a split second, relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by dread as I glanced back toward the woods. The beams of flashlights were still visible, weaving closer. The truck's driver rolled down the window, a grizzled man in his 60s with a no-nonsense expression. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, his voice gruff but wary. "Please," I gasped, barely able to get the words out. "There are guys in the woods. They're after me. You've got to help." His eyes narrowed as he scanned the trees, then nodded. "Get in." I didn't need to be told twice. I yanked open the passenger door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The driver wasted no time, throwing the truck into gear and peeling out onto the highway. My chest heaved as I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out in a frantic, incoherent mess. He didn't seem to need much convincing. "Stay down," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency in his eyes. "If they've got a car, we don't want them spotting you." As I ducked below the dashboard, I caught a glimpse of headlights appearing in the side mirror. My stomach lurched. They'd found a vehicle, and they were following us. The truck's engine growled as the driver pressed harder on the gas, but the other car was closing the distance fast. "Hang on," he barked, gripping the wheel tightly. Without warning, he swerved off the highway onto a dirt path that I hadn't even noticed in the darkness. The truck bounced and jolted as we tore through the trees, but it seemed to be working. The headlights behind us faltered, then disappeared entirely. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under the tires and my own ragged breathing. I stayed low, afraid to look back, until the driver finally slowed down and pulled onto a small, deserted side road. "I think we lost him," he said, his voice calm but firm. I sat up, my body still trembling, and glanced out the window. The woods were dense here, and there was no sign of any headlights or flashlights behind us. The driver turned to me, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What the hell happened back there?" he asked. I tried to explain everything, the broken down car, the men in the woods, the RV, but it all sounded insane as the words spilled out. He nodded slowly, then reached for the CB radio mounted on his dashboard. "We're calling the cops," he said. I didn't argue. Part of me worried they wouldn't believe me, but I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be somewhere safe. The police showed up about half an hour later, their cruiser's lights flashing in the distance as they navigated the back roads. The driver stayed with me the whole time, even as I gave my statement. When we returned to the area where it all started, my car was gone, along with everything I'd packed for the trip. The RV. Still there, but completely ransacked. The police said they'd seen setups like this before, criminals using fake breakdowns to lure in good Samaritans. "You're lucky you got away," one of the officers told me. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that luck had nothing to do with it. I haven't been on a road trip since. Even now, years later, I get a knot in my stomach every time I see hazard lights on the side of the road. I wish I could say I learned some profound lesson or found closure, but the truth is, I still don't know why they picked me or what they would have done if they'd caught me. What I do know is this: never stop for strangers on a dark highway. You might think you're helping, but sometimes you're just walking straight into a trap. The creepy restroom encounter. I was about 4 hours into my overnight drive when I decided to stop at a rest area. It was one of those isolated ones, with a single building for the restroom and a couple of vending machines flickering in the cold, fluorescent light. I hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes before I pulled in, so the place was eerily quiet. It felt like I was the only person for miles, which was fine, until it wasn't. The restroom looked old and run down, but it was clean enough for a quick pit stop. As I walked inside, the echo of my footsteps felt unnervingly loud, and I could hear the faint hum of a flickering bulb above the sinks. The place was empty except for one stall at the far end that was closed. I tried to ignore it, figuring someone else was just passing through like me. But as I approached the urinals, I noticed something strange: a pair of boots, facing the wrong way, like the person was standing on the other side of the door instead of sitting. I froze for a second, feeling a shiver run down my back. Maybe they were cleaning or fixing something. I didn't hear any movement, though. Just silence. Trying to brush it off, I did what I came there to do, washed my hands quickly, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the stall door creak open behind me. I didn't look back right away, but I could hear heavy, deliberate footsteps behind me. The kind that made your stomach knot up because you know you're not imagining things. I told myself to stay calm and walk toward the door, acting like I hadn't noticed anything. Just as I reached out to push it open, I felt a presence. Close, too close. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to glance over my shoulder. The man was standing there, staring at me. He was tall and gaunt, with an unsettlingly blank expression, like his face had been wiped clean of any emotion. His clothes were dirty, almost like he'd been sleeping outside for a while. What got me, though, were his eyes. They didn't blink, didn't shift, just locked onto mine like he was sizing me up. I muttered something like, "Excuse me," and pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold night air. I expected him to stay inside, but he didn't. He followed me out, his boots crunching on the gravel, slow and steady. As soon as I reached my car, I unlocked it and got inside as quickly as I could. I didn't want to look panicked, but my hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys to start the engine. The man had stopped a few feet away, standing under the dim light outside the restroom building. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at me. It was the kind of stare that feels like it's peeling layers off you, and I couldn't shake the sense that he was somehow enjoying my discomfort. My gut was screaming at me to leave, so I did. I pulled out of the lot, glancing in my rearview mirror just long enough to see him still standing there, motionless, as I drove away. I thought that was the end of it, but about 15 minutes later, I saw headlights in my mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and this stretch of highway was pretty deserted. Maybe someone else was on a long drive like me. But then the car started getting closer. It wasn't tailgating me exactly, but it felt intentional, like whoever was behind the wheel wanted me to notice. My chest tightened when I realized it was an old beat-up truck, the same kind I'd noticed parked near the restroom earlier. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But when I switched lanes, the truck switched too, and I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to overreact, but my mind was racing. I stayed calm and kept driving, hoping they'd back off or take an exit. But no matter how far I went or how many times I switched lanes, they stayed right behind me. The air in my car felt suffocating, and I kept checking the mirrors, hoping, praying they'd disappear. After another 10 minutes of this, I spotted a sign for another rest area up ahead. I debated whether stopping was a good idea, but my options felt limited. Maybe they'd pass me if I pulled in. Or, worst case scenario, there'd be cameras or even someone else there to help. I turned into the rest stop, heart hammering. The place was just as deserted as the last one. I parked near the restroom building, leaving my engine running, and watched in my rearview mirror as the truck pulled in behind me. It parked a few spaces away, its headlights beaming into my car like a spotlight. I could barely make out the driver's silhouette, but I knew it was him, the same man from the first stop. He got out of the truck slowly, deliberately, and started walking toward my car. My first instinct was to drive off, but before I could, he stopped a few feet away, just standing there like before. Only this time, he had a grin on his face, wide and unsettling. That grin, it sent chills through me. It wasn't friendly or even mocking. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who knows they've got the upper hand, like he was savoring whatever twisted game he thought he was playing. I didn't roll my window down or acknowledge him. Instead, I reached for my phone, hands shaking so much it almost slipped out of my grip. As I unlocked it and pulled up the dialer, the man leaned closer to my car, placing his hands on the hood. His smile widened, and he tilted his head, as if daring me to make a move. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator where I was and what was happening. She stayed calm, asking for details, and assured me help was on the way. I didn't dare take my eyes off the man. When he saw the phone to my ear, his grin faded. He stood there for a moment, watching me with a kind of detached curiosity. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his truck. I watched as he got in, started the engine, and drove off into the night, leaving me sitting there with my heart pounding in my chest. I stayed on the line with the 911 operator until I was sure the truck was gone. She asked if I wanted to wait for an officer to meet me there, but all I could think about was putting as much distance between me and that man as possible. I thanked her and said I'd be fine, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. My hands were still shaking as I merged back onto the highway, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds to make sure I wasn't being followed again. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere. The rest of the drive felt surreal. Every shadow, every pair of headlights in the distance made my chest tighten. I kept running the whole thing over in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? Why was he acting like that? Was it just some twisted prank, or was he planning to do something worse? I'll never know, and maybe that's the part that haunts me the most. Even now, whenever I'm on a long drive and see a rest stop, I think of that night. I've never stopped at one again, not even during the day. Whatever his intentions were, I'm just grateful I got away. But the look in his eyes, and that grin, I'll never forget it.